It is July 1956. Hanover, New Hampshire. The campus of Dartmouth College sits quiet in the summer heat. Elms line the paths between the old brick buildings. The Connecticut River Valley stretches out beyond the hills, green and unhurried, the kind of landscape that makes the rest of the world feel very far away. Most of the students are gone. The college belongs, for now, to the faculty and the heat and the sound of insects. Inside one of those brick buildings, a small group of men are settling into a room. There are 10 of them on the official list, though the actual number shifts day to day. Some will stay the whole 2 months. Others will appear for a week, drop a hand grenade of an idea into the conversation, and disappear back to their universities. But right now, in this moment, they are here: mathematicians, engineers, psychologists, a cognitive scientist, a philosopher of mind. Most of them are in their 20s or early 30s. Most of them are, professionally speaking, nobody yet. They have a proposal. A funding grant of $7,500 from the Rockefeller Foundation. A 2-month window. And a conjecture, a single, audacious sentence about what they believe is possible, that will eventually be recognized as one of the most consequential claims in the history of science. They do not know that yet. They are just 10 young men in a room in New Hampshire, in the summer of 1956, about to give a name to something that will outlast all of them. This is the story of the Dartmouth Conference, the moment artificial intelligence was born. Welcome to Minds and Machines, the story of AI. This is E1, the first entry in our events track, deep dives into the particular days, rooms, and moments that changed the direction of history. I am your host, and today we are going to Dartmouth. Before we open that door, we need to understand what the world looked like from the outside. It is 1956. The war has been over for 11 years. America is in a mood of almost uncomfortable optimism, suburban houses going up by the thousand, cars getting bigger, nuclear power promising limitless cheap energy, and computers, these new, enormous, expensive, humming machines, seeming to promise something that nobody can quite put into words yet. Something vast. Something transformative. Something just over the horizon. The intellectual pieces of what will become artificial intelligence have been assembling for years, but in fragments, scattered across different universities, different disciplines, different countries. Like pieces of a puzzle that no one has yet realized belong to the same box. Alan Turing published his landmark paper asking whether machines can think in 1950. A prominent American mathematician published Cybernetics, his framework for thinking about communication and control in both machines and biological organisms, in 1948. Claude Shannon invented information theory, also in 1948, giving scientists for the first time a precise mathematical language for talking about data and meaning. The first electronic computers, ENIAC, EDVAC, and their successors, have been built and are slowly becoming available to researchers willing to wrestle with their enormous complexity and cost. There is work on neural networks, mathematical models of how biological neurons might process information. In 1943, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts showed that networks of simple artificial neurons could in principle compute any logical function. In 1949, Donald Hebb proposed a learning rule describing how connections between neurons might strengthen through use, a possible mechanism for how artificial systems might actually learn from experience. All of this is happening. All of it is potentially revolutionary. All of it is also completely scattered. Researchers working on neural networks have not read the work of researchers building game-playing programs. People thinking about the logic of machine reasoning are in different departments, different disciplines, different intellectual traditions from people thinking about machine perception. There is no common vocabulary. No agreed-upon set of central problems. No shared identity. And crucially, there is no name. Without a name, there is no field. Without a field, there is no community, no way to organize conferences, recruit students, allow grants, or argue to a university administration that this work deserves its own department. The research exists. But it does not yet know that it is research in the same thing. That is about to change. His name is John McCarthy, and he is 28 years old. McCarthy was born in Boston in 1927, the son of Irish and Lithuanian immigrant parents. His father was a labor organizer. His mother was an activist. He grew up in a household that treated ideas as serious business, as tools for engaging with and changing the world, not decorations for a dinner party. He was, by all accounts, one of those children for whom no problem was ever quite enough. Mathematics, physics, anything with a puzzle at its center consumed his attention completely. He enrolled at Caltech at 16. PhD at Princeton in mathematics, finished in 1951. By the time he arrives at Dartmouth as a young instructor, he has already been circling the question of machine intelligence for years, reading everything, thinking hard, growing increasingly frustrated with the fragmentation of a field that does not yet know it is a field. McCarthy's frustration is particular. He believes that intelligent behavior can be understood as information processing, that the rules and procedures underlying human reasoning can, in principle, be made explicit, and that if you make them explicit, you can implement them in a computer program. He does not want to theorize about this. He wants to build it and see if it works. But the people he needs to talk to are scattered across the country, working in isolation, not reading each other's papers. So McCarthy does the thing that seems obvious to him and would not have occurred to most people. He decides to put them all in a room. He recruits 3 co-organizers, and the recruitment alone tells you something about how McCarthy thinks. Marvin Minsky, 29, brilliant, already building neural network machines in his Harvard lab, the most intellectually electric person in the nascent field. Nathaniel Rochester, the lead designer of the IBM 701, the most powerful scientific computer in commercial existence, a man who can actually make the machines work. And Claude Shannon, 39, already a legend, the inventor of information theory, one of the most celebrated scientists in America. With those 3 names attached to the proposal, McCarthy has something with genuine gravity behind it. He writes the proposal in 1955. He sends it to the Rockefeller Foundation. And in it, he includes a sentence. The proposal is called, A Proposal for the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence. It describes a 2-month summer research project. 10 carefully selected researchers. Particular topics: automatic computers, programming computers to use language, neural networks, the theory of the size of computation, self-improvement, abstraction, randomness and creativity. But then, near the beginning, before the list of topics, before the names, before the budget, there it is. We propose that a 2-month, 10-month study of artificial intelligence be carried out during the summer of 1956 at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. The study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. 2 things in that sentence matter enormously. Let us take them one at a time. First, the name. Artificial intelligence. McCarthy considered and rejected other options. Automata studies, too narrow. Complex information processing, too vague, too bloodless. Cybernetics, already claimed by the cybernetics pioneer, whose conception of the field diverged from McCarthy's in important ways. McCarthy wanted a name that was direct, that pointed without ambiguity at the central ambition, that staked a claim anyone could understand. Artificial intelligence does all of that. It is bold. It is slightly provocative. It dares you to argue with it. And it is impossible to misunderstand. This is the first recorded use of the term in a formal document. The field gets its name right here in this sentence. Second, the conjecture. Every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. Read that slowly. It is a very strong claim. It says that all of intelligence, not some of it, not the easy mechanical parts of it, but all of it, is in principle formalizable. That it can be broken down into rules and procedures clear enough that a machine could replicate them. This was not a universally accepted view in 1955. It is not a universally accepted view in 2026. Many philosophers, cognitive scientists, and AI researchers have argued at various points that human intelligence involves things that resist formalization, embodied experience, emotion, consciousness, intuition. These arguments are serious. They are not settled. But McCarthy is not writing a philosophy paper. He is writing a funding proposal. He is drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is the bet. This is what we are going to work on. Join us if you believe it. The Rockefeller Foundation sends $7,500, roughly $85,000 in today's money. Not a large sum, but enough. Now we need to populate that room. Because the 10 people who gather at Dartmouth in the summer of 1956 are not a random collection of smart people. They are, taken together, a concentration of intellectual firepower that is almost unreasonable. McCarthy himself is working, in parallel with organizing the conference, on what will become Lisp, list processing, a programming language designed particularly for AI research, built around the manipulation of symbolic structures rather than numbers. He will publish it in 1958. It will become the dominant language of AI research for the next 30 years and will influence the design of virtually every programming language that follows it. Marvin Minsky arrives with history already behind him. In 1951, 5 years before Dartmouth, Minsky built one of the first neural network machines, a device called SNARC, simulating a network of 40 artificial neurons learning to navigate a maze. It was crude by any later standard. But it was real. It ran. Minsky has already done the thing he and McCarthy are now proposing to study. Nathaniel Rochester comes carrying a failure that is still fresh. Before the conference, he attempted to simulate a neural network on the IBM 701, the machine he himself designed. The simulation did not work the way he expected. The network did not learn. He does not fully understand why. That unresolved question is on his mind as he settles into the room. Claude Shannon appears briefly. He is, by 1956, untouchable, the inventor of information theory, the author of the paper that gave the mathematical sciences a new way to think about meaning and communication. He lends the conference a credibility that no other attendee could provide. But he drifts in and out, present for only a few days before returning to Bell Labs. And then there are Alan Newell and Herbert Simon. Newell is a young researcher from the R&D Corporation, the influential Cold War think tank where some of the most advanced computing work in America is happening. Simon is something rarer, a genuine polymath, economist, political scientist, psychologist, computer scientist, and eventual Nobel laureate. Together, they have done something no one else in the room has done. They have built a working AI program. It is called the Logic Theorist. And it proves mathematical theorems. Not just any theorems. Theorems from a monumental 3-volume work of mathematics, an attempt by two of the greatest minds of the early 20th century to ground all of mathematics in pure logic. The logic theorist has proved 38 of the first 52 theorems in that work. In one case, it produced a proof that was more elegant than the one the original authors themselves had found. Pause on that. A computer program, running on the hardware of 1956, found a better proof than two of the greatest mathematical minds of the 20th century. Newell and Simon arrive at Dartmouth having already, arguably, done what everyone else in the room is still trying to figure out how to do. They are excited. They want the room to be excited with them. The reception they receive is, by several accounts, more muted than they expected. The remaining attendees include a researcher working on probability and inductive reasoning, whose name could later become associated with a famous theory of prediction. Oliver Selfridge, building models of pattern recognition. Trenchard Moore, a mathematician. And Arthur Samuel, not on the original list but present, and already quietly famous for something the rest of the field has not quite caught up to yet, a checkers playing program that improves its own performance through self-play and evaluation. Samuel's program does not just execute a fixed strategy. It evaluates its own games, adjusts its own weightings, and gets better over time, without being explicitly told how to get better. He will later name what his program does, machine learning. The phrase will stick for the next 70 years. Now we need to be honest about something. Because the Dartmouth Conference is often described in reverent terms, the founding moment, the week the field was born, the room that changed history. And in one crucial sense, that is true. But in terms of what actually happened inside that building over those 2 months, the reality was messier, more human, and considerably more chaotic than the founding myth suggests. McCarthy had imagined a structured collaborative research project. 10 people working together on shared problems, pooling their thinking, producing results. What he got was more like a rotating seminar, individual presentations, parallel work on separate projects, occasional arguments that sharpened ideas without resolving them. Attendance was inconsistent. Shannon barely showed up. Several attendees spent most of their time working alone on the available computers rather than engaging with the group. The 10 people on the invitation list never functioned as a coherent team. And beneath the surface logistics, there was a deeper fracture, one that would define the field for the next 60 years. Newell and Simon, with their logic theorist, represented one vision of what AI was and how it worked. In their view, intelligence was fundamentally about the manipulation of symbols according to explicit rules. You could write down the rules, the conditions, the operations, the logic, implement them in a program, and produce intelligent behavior. This approach was rigorous, interpretable, and felt like science. You could look at what the program was doing and understand why. Minsky and Rochester represented a different intuition entirely. They were drawn to neural networks, systems that learned their own internal representations rather than having rules written for them. Neural networks were messier, harder to analyze, harder to explain. But they learned. They adapted. They held the promise of acquiring capabilities that nobody had explicitly programmed, the way biological brains do. These two visions, symbolic AI and connectionism, rules and learning, explicit knowledge and emergent representation, would compete for dominance in AI research for the next 6 decades. At Dartmouth in the summer of 1956, both were in the room, both were argued for, and no consensus emerged. The argument simply continued. There was also a question that surfaced and was never properly answered. What, exactly, were they trying to build? McCarthy's conjecture implied a goal of general intelligence, systems that could do anything an intelligent person could do, across any domain, in a flexible and adaptive way. Artificial general intelligence. That was the dream. But the programs people were actually building were narrow. Startlingly, embarrassingly narrow. A program that proved theorems could not play checkers. A program that played checkers could not hold a conversation. A program that recognized simple patterns could not pass a sentence. The hardware constraints of 1956 made narrowness a practical necessity. But the gap between the dream of general intelligence and the reality of highly specialized programs raised a question nobody was comfortable sitting with. Was any of this actually intelligence? Or was it something that looked like intelligence from a distance, a very sophisticated trick, but was fundamentally something else? That question, narrow versus general, performance versus understanding, echoes directly into 2026. It is the argument underneath every debate about whether large language models are really intelligent or just doing sophisticated pattern matching. Dartmouth did not invent the question. But it is where the question was first seriously encountered by the people who would spend their careers trying to answer it. So if it was chaotic, incomplete, and unresolved, what did Dartmouth actually give the world? 3 things. In ascending order of importance. Third, particular intellectual progress. The logic theorist got extended attention and critique that sharpened Newell and Simon's thinking about what came next. The year after Dartmouth, they would build the General Problem Solver, a program designed not to solve any particular class of problems but to implement a general strategy for problem solving applicable, in principle, to any domain. It used a technique called means-ends analysis, identify the gap between where you are and where you want to be, and choose actions that close that gap. Elegant in conception, genuinely powerful in limited applications, and a direct product of the thinking that Dartmouth catalyzed. McCarthy's work on Lisp was clarified and sharpened through the conversations at the conference. Ideas that had been developing in isolation got friction, pushback, and refinement. Second, a community. Before Dartmouth, there was no AI community. There were individual researchers, working largely alone, often unaware of each other's most relevant work. After Dartmouth, there was a group of people who knew each other, who had argued face to face, who understood each other's ideas well enough to compete with them, who would go on to train the next generation of researchers in the same tradition. This community formation is easy to dismiss as soft, as social rather than scientific. It is not. Science happens in communities. The informal conversation, the competitive awareness of what someone else is working on, the ability to pick up the phone and argue, these are not peripheral to scientific progress. They are how scientific progress happens. First, and most important, the name. Artificial intelligence. 2 words that did not constitute a field before McCarthy wrote them into a proposal, and did afterwards. Once the name existed, everything else became possible. Grant applications could reference it. Cost listings could use it. Department heads could be lobbied for it. Students could identify themselves as working in it. The name created the category, and the category shaped thought and action and institutional reality for the next 70 years. Names are not just labels. They are acts of organization. They determine what counts as part of the same project, who is in the same conversation, what problems are related to what other problems. Artificial intelligence, McCarthy's deliberate, bold, slightly provocative choice, organized a scattered intellectual landscape into something coherent enough to become a field. That is not nothing. That is, in a very real sense, everything. But Dartmouth cast a shadow as long as its founding light. And the shadow was made of overconfidence. The proposal McCarthy sent to the Rockefeller Foundation contained, alongside its audacious naming and its careful listing of topics, a claim so optimistic it verges on the comic in retrospect. The entire project, McCarthy wrote, was proposed on the assumption that significant progress could be made on these problems if a carefully selected group worked together. For a summer. 2 months. Significant advances on machine intelligence. In 2 months. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because the overconfidence was not the quirk of a naive person. McCarthy was not naive. Neither were Minsky, Newell, or Simon. These were among the most rigorous minds of their generation. And yet they genuinely believed, in the summer of 1956, that the problems they were taking on were problems that could be substantially cracked in a few months of concentrated effort. The mid-1950s explain some of this. America in 1956 is riding a wave of technological achievement. The war was won. Nuclear power seems to promise unlimited energy. Computers are improving at a pace that feels like it cannot stop. In that climate, the assumption that this particular set of problems, language, learning, reasoning, abstraction, would yield within years rather than decades did not feel irrational. It felt like the natural tempo of the moment. The particular results of the logic theorist and Samuel Checker's program reinforced the optimism. Both programs did things that had previously seemed to require human intelligence. The natural inference, made by brilliant people who should perhaps have known better, was that if machines could do these things, surely the rest was a matter of time. A year, maybe. 5 years. Certainly not 50. This reasoning, impressive particular demonstration leads to confident general prediction, is a pattern that runs through the entire history of AI like a recurring fever. And it has been wrong every single time it has been applied. The particular demonstration works. The general capability does not follow as quickly, or in the same form, or through the same methods, as the optimists predict. Marvin Minsky would later claim that within a generation the problem of creating artificial intelligence would be substantially solved. Herbert Simon predicted in 1957 that within 10 years a computer would be the world's chess champion and would prove an important new mathematical theorem. Both were wrong. By decades. The consequences were not immediate. The field grew through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, new programs, new institutions, new funding, new excitement. But the gap between the promises and the reality was quietly opening. And when it became impossible to ignore, when programs that worked in carefully constrained laboratory settings failed to scale to the messiness of the real world, when the combinatorial explosion made the search-based approaches of symbolic AI intractable, the collapse was severe. By the early 1970s, AI's first winter had arrived. Funding cut. Reputations damaged. The whole enterprise questioned. Those seeds were planted at Dartmouth, in the gap between the boldness of the conjecture and the grinding difficulty of the reality. One more thing needs to be said about what Dartmouth divided, because what it divided turned out to matter more than what it unified. In that room in Hanover, the two great traditions of AI research coexisted for the last time as equals. Symbolic AI and connectionism. Rules and learning. Explicit knowledge and emergent representation. After Dartmouth, symbolic AI dominated. It dominated for 30 years. The logic theorist was concrete, demonstrable, impressive. Neural networks were struggling to show results on the hardware of the late 1950s. The funding went to symbolic AI, the institutions were built around symbolic AI, the textbooks were written for symbolic AI. And in the 1980s, symbolic AI produced its great commercial moment, expert systems, AI that worked in narrow professional domains, that made real money solving real problems. And then it collapsed again. The brittleness of rule-based systems, their inability to handle anything outside their explicit programming, became impossible to deny. Meanwhile, the connectionist tradition, kept alive through years of rejection and funding cuts by a small number of stubborn researchers, most notably a British-Canadian cognitive psychologist and computer scientist, a French-born pioneer of convolutional networks, and an Italian-born researcher who could develop recurrent neural networks, was quietly developing the tools that would eventually become the foundation of everything we interact with today. The approach that turned out to be most fundamentally correct was present at Dartmouth in 1956. It did not win the argument that summer. It did not win the argument for another 50 years. But it was there, in Minsky's neural network interests, in Rochester's failed simulation and his unresolved questions about why it failed, waiting in the room. History is sometimes made by the people who do not quite win the immediate argument. The summer ends. The men leave Hanover and return to their universities and their labs. McCarthy goes to MIT, then Stanford, where in 1963 he founds the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, one of the two institutions that will dominate AI research for the next 3 decades. Lisp becomes the field's standard language. Minsky co-founds MIT's AI lab with McCarthy in 1959. He becomes the public face of AI in the 1960s, the person journalists call for a quote, the face of the field to the outside world. His predictions are characteristically wrong on the timelines. They keep AI in the public imagination through years of unglamorous grinding work. Newell and Simon build the general problem solver. Simon wins the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1978, partly for his work on bounded rationality, the idea that human decision-making operates under real constraints of time and information. That work is directly downstream of his thinking at Dartmouth about how programs solve problems. Arthur Samuels Checker's program becomes famous, one of the first AI demonstrations that a general audience can understand and be moved by. His phrase machine learning enters the language and stays there. The field grows. The institutions compound. The funding flows. Until it does not. But that is the story of other episodes. What matters right now, at the end of this particular summer, is what has been left behind in that building in Hanover, a name, a community, a conjecture, and 2 approaches to intelligence that will compete, diverge, collapse, revive, and ultimately converge into something that changes the world. The Dartmouth Conference is nearly 70 years ago. The computers they used had less processing power than a wristwatch. The particular approach it championed, symbolic AI, rule-based reasoning, has been largely superseded by methods its founders would barely recognize. So why does it still matter? 3 reasons. First, the conjecture is still the conjecture. Every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. This is still, right now, in 2026, the fundamental working assumption of every AI researcher on Earth. The approaches have changed beyond recognition. The timelines have been stretched by decades, and then by more decades. But the core claim, that intelligence is a natural phenomenon that can be understood, formalized, and replicated, remains the premise on which the entire field operates. The debate about whether that premise is correct is still live. It is the same debate Dartmouth opened. Second, the community it created is the community that built everything else. The researchers at Dartmouth, and the students they train, and the students those students train, constitute the intellectual lineage of modern AI. The problems McCarthy listed, language, learning, abstraction, self-improvement, are still the central problems of AI. The technology is unrecognizable. The questions are identical. Third, it is a lesson in the importance and the danger of founding myths. Dartmouth is AI's creation story. And like all creation stories, it simplifies. The ideas had been developing for decades before 1956. Turing, a mathematical genius, the cybernetics pioneer, Shannon, the people most important to what AI became, were not all in the room. The approach that turned out to be most fruitful was present but not dominant. The truth is messier and more interesting than the myth. It always is. The summer of 1956 was not the summer AI was invented. But it was the summer AI was born. The summer it got a name, a community, a shared set of problems, and an argument it has been having with itself ever since. Here is what strikes me most, sitting with this story in 2026. When you read the conversations happening today about AI, the excitement and the fear, the arguments about whether these systems are genuinely intelligent or very sophisticated pattern matchers, the questions about what it would mean for a machine to truly learn and create, the debates about what we owe to things we have built, you are reading the continuation of a conversation that began in a single room in New Hampshire in the summer of 1956. The technology is unrecognizable. A modern large language model contains more parameters than there are neurons in the human brain. The training data dwarfs everything that Dartmouth attendees could have imagined. The capabilities, writing, reasoning, coding, translating, composing, diagnosing, would look like sorcery to the men in that room. And yet the question is identical. Can we build a machine that thinks? McCarthy wrote it into a proposal at 28 years old and gave it a name. 70 years later, with tools he could not have dreamed of, with results he would not have believed, with consequences that dwarf anything he imagined, we are still trying to answer it. We have not finished. That is E1, the Dartmouth Conference, 1956, the summer AI was born. What I want you to hold on to from this episode is not the names or the dates or the particular programs. It is the texture of that room. 10 young people, enormously talented, slightly overconfident, arguing about a question none of them could fully answer, and in the act of arguing about it together, making it real enough to outlast all of them. Science is made in rooms like that. Not by lone geniuses arriving at perfect insights, but by people in conversation, competing, misunderstanding each other, talking past each other, and occasionally striking something true. Next in the events track, E2, the Turing Test, 1950. 6 years before Dartmouth, a mathematician published a paper that asked a deceptively simple question: can machines think? The paper proposed a test. The test became famous. The question became the founding philosophical problem of an entire field, and it has never been resolved. We will sit with that question properly and understand exactly why it refuses to die. If this episode is landing for you, please subscribe on whatever platform you are using and share it with one person who would care about this history. It makes a genuine difference to this series reaching the people it is meant for. I will see you in the next room.